Okay, Harmy, in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the Chapter 2 study guide. There's quite a bit there. There are notes on PowerSchool that you can look at that'll help you, but I also went over the study guide after everyone had completed it, so I'm going to do that with you. There are, I think, 6 questions, but a couple of them are pretty involved. So I'm going to go over question 1 and 2. 1 is very involved, and then in a second video, I should be able to get 3, 4, 5, and 6 done. But here we go. Question 1 asks about a multitude of things, but it all centers around the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Constitutional Convention came about because of Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was had been a captain in the Continental Army, and after the war, he and other Massachusetts farmers were losing their lands because of the inordinately high taxes they were having to pay. Massachusetts was taxing them at a very high rate, and they couldn't pay the taxes, and so farms that had been in families for generations were being lost. And these farmers felt they had no redress, they had no action they could take to stop this, so they rebelled against the Massachusetts government. And the rebellion was put down, but the rebellion was important because it was like the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. It was that action at the end of a culmination of actions that led people in the country to say, hey, you know what, these Articles of Confederation that we've been under since the end of the war are not working. And the Articles were not a good document. They were a weak document. They were weak because primarily they gave all the power to the states and very little to the national government. The national government couldn't tax. The national government did not have the commerce power, which is the power to regulate trade. And so trade between the states was very lacked organization, and it was different from state to state, and it wasn't very efficient. And they didn't have a coercive power, a power to force the states to follow any laws that the national government did pass. And so the Articles were a weak document. And Shays' Rebellion was the event that led them to realize that we need to do something about the Articles of Confederation. We need to fix them. So every colony sent representatives to Philadelphia for what would be called the Philadelphia Convention to fix the Articles. James Madison from Virginia arrived with a plan not to fix the Articles, but to write an entirely new Constitution. And after a short bit of discussion, it was agreed upon that they would write a new Constitution. So the Philadelphia Convention became the Constitutional Convention. Now, one of the main issues at the Constitutional Convention was, well, let me backtrack. So James Madison had a plan. It was known as the Virginia Plan. It favored big states, big as far as population, states that had large populations, and it called for a three-branch government, and the legislative branch, the Congress of this branch, would have 2 houses. It would be bicameral, 2 houses, and both houses would be based on population. In other words, representation in those houses would be based on population. So the more population you had, the more representatives you would send to this Congress. So it greatly benefited the large states. It was called the Large State Plan or the Big State Plan. And other big states, as far as population, New York, for example, were great supporters of the Virginia Plan. But New Jersey said, wait a second, that's not fair. And New Jersey proposed a plan. Their plan called for a unicameral legislature, but that unicameral legislature would be equal representation. Every state would have the same amount of representatives. And they said that's much more fair. That way, one large or a group of large states wouldn't dominate the entire Congress. And so Virginia and New Jersey went back and forth. And then Connecticut had a solution. They said, well, why don't we have a compromise? The Connecticut Compromise, or what's commonly known as the Great Compromise, took aspects of both the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan and created a legislature where we would have 2 houses, but one would be based on the population that Virginia wanted, and one would be equal representation that Virginia wanted. So the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, because Connecticut is the state that proposed it, is the first of the compromises that you need to know about. So the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and the Great Compromise. Another compromise that you need to be aware of is the 3/5 Compromise. So how are we going to count slaves? That's the issue that brought the 3/5 Compromise into issue. How are we going to count slaves? The southern states said, we want to count the slaves as part of our population when determining our representation in this new Congress, because if you count the slaves, your population is going to be more, and you'll get more representatives. And the northern states said, that's fine, you can do that, but then you're also going to have to count your slaves as part of your population for tax purposes. And the South said, no, we don't want to count the slaves for tax purposes. And the North said, that's fine, you don't have to count them for tax purposes, but then you don't get to count them for purposes of representation either. It's got to be you count them for both, or you don't count them for either. And so this was a conflict. This was a debate. And so the solution was the 3/5 Compromise, that we'll count 3/5 of the slaves. But what they're suggesting is that slaves aren't people. They are subhuman. They are property. And this was not an easy rationalization for even Southerners to come to. But they accepted it, and they being the Southern states, started this process of dehumanizing slaves, because they had to, in a way, justify and rationalize the treatment of the slaves. If you remember from your U.S. history, not all slaves, or not all slave owners in the beginning in the 16 and early 1700s mistreated their slaves. In fact, many of them were like part of the family. And that continued some, but not nearly as much as prior. In fact, it was not uncommon upon the slave owner's death for slaves to be set free. But all this changed. And so by the time we get to the Civil War, they're being mistreated and so forth. So the long process from the 3/5 Compromise to the antebellum era, leading right up to the Civil War, in which slaves were greatly mistreated, that didn't happen overnight. There was a dehumanizing process that occurred, where Southerners slowly started to rationalize and start looking at slaves as property and not human. And it started with the 3/5 Compromise as part of the Constitution. So really what that means in a practical sense then is that if a slave, or if a state has slaves, let's say they have 1,000 slaves, 3/5 of 1,000 is 600. So they would count 600 slaves towards their population for both representation and taxes. That's the 3/5 Compromise. Okay. The next compromise, or the last compromise I want to talk about, is the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. If you remember just a little bit ago, I talked about how under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had no power to regulate trade. They did not have the commerce power. So in this new Constitution, all the states recognized that Congress had to have the commerce power. But Southern states wanted them to have the commerce power, but they were afraid that once they had the commerce power, they would use it to regulate the slave trade. And they would use it to tax exports, things like tobacco that were being shipped overseas. Now, remember, at this time, cotton wasn't the big product that it later would be. So tobacco was the big thing that they were shipping overseas. So the agreement then was, yes, Congress would get the commerce power, but they couldn't regulate the slave trade for 20 years until 1808, and they couldn't tax exports. And we still don't tax exports. We do tax imports, but we don't tax exports. So that's the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. So the Constitution is written, and now it's going to be sent to the states for ratification. And two groups developed, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are those who support the Constitution. They support the ratification of the Constitution because they support federalism. Federalism is the division of government power between a national or central government and local governments. So in our case, that means between the national government and the state governments. And that power would be independent Each level would have its own protections. One level could not supersede the other level. The federal government, the national government couldn't come in and tell the states what to do in those powers that the states had. And so it was a very good way of limiting power because national government has power, state government has power, but it also protected the states. The Anti-Federalists didn't like federalism. They thought it went back towards a unitary style where the central government has all the power. That's what we had when we were part of England. We were under a unitary or a centralized style of government. And the articles swung all the way over to the opposite, where all the local governments had the power. So federalism is kind of a compromise in between that. But the Anti-Federalists thought it went too far. So in response to the Anti-Federalists not liking this new Constitution, the Federalists started writing a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. And these papers were these were essays designed to convince the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists to ratify the Constitution. Two of the Federalist Papers that are most important are Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. Federalist 10 talks about factions, or what we would call political parties today, and how to control them. There's two ways you can deal with factions or political parties, according to James Madison, who's the author of Federalist 10. He said you can get rid of those things that cause factions or political parties to develop. In other words, you can get rid of people's opinions and make everyone believe the same thing. Well, you can't do that. That's totally contrary to what this new country is all about. People are going to have their opinions, differing opinions, and we celebrate that. We encourage that. So you can't get rid of the causes of political parties or of factions. But what you can do is control the effects. And James Madison argued that this new Constitution was the best way to control the effects of political parties or of factions, the fighting and the conflict that was so prevalent in the 18th century. It's not so prevalent today, but it was in the 18th century. Federalist 51 was about separation of powers and checks and balances, the separating of power among the three branches that keeps government limited. So with federalism, we've divided the power and we've separated the power through separation of powers. And the checks and balances, which is the system that protects separation of powers, that allows each branch to have its powers and not become dominated by one of the other branches. Each branch has a check on the other branches. For example, Congress can pass a bill, but the president still has to sign it. The president can appoint someone to office, but Congress, specifically the Senate, will hold confirmation hearings to confirm that person, which is a big issue right now, as you know, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and now there's an opening on the Supreme Court. And the Democrats want to put someone up right away, and the Republicans want to hold off. I'm sorry, Republicans want to put someone in right away. The Democrats want to hold off, just like the Republicans had argued that we should hold off back in 2016 when Justice Scalia died. So there's a big conflict there. But that's one of the things. That's one of the checks that the Congress, specifically the Senate, has on the president. Okay. So that's the Federalist Papers. The Bill of Rights was a big issue. There was not a Bill of Rights originally in the Constitution because the Federalists argued we don't need a national Bill of Rights because each state has its own Bill of Rights. And the national government can't come in and supersede those anyway. So we don't need a national Bill of Rights. And the state said, well, we would like to have a national Bill of Rights. So eventually a Bill of Rights was added. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution was added, and that helped convince the Anti-Federalists to ratify the Constitution as well. Okay, real quick, question number 2 was about limited government, or was about how does the Constitution limit government power? And as I was just talking about it limits it through federalism, dividing the power between national and state governments, and also separation of powers where we distribute it among the different branches. So we divide it and then we distribute it through the separation of powers and the protections of separation of powers through checks and balances. So that's question 1 and 2 on the study guide. I'm going to stop there, and I will add another video later that covers 3 through 6. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. That's the first 2 questions on the Chapter 2 study guide. Talk to you soon. Bye.